Hello, everyone, and welcome to my office. I finally made it down my stairs. No cast, no foot worries. I'm good to go. So I'm pretty excited about that, but I'm not excited about the quality of my camera in this room, and I'm not sure what's going on. It could be the background. It could be that it just doesn't want to adjust. It could be my hair. Who the heck knows? All I know is that it's very flickery. I'm not sure if you guys are seeing that on your end or not. You probably are. So if anybody has any tips on how to make this better, please let me know. I don't know if it's the color I'm wearing, the background, the lighting. I have no idea. I've tried every permutation possible. This camera is only about 2 years old, so I'm not really sure why it's doing this. It looks like I'm filming this like 10 years ago. Anyway, I'm not. I'm here with you today in 2021, and I imagine that this video has probably been fairly well anticipated because I haven't given you much yet, and we're headed into week 3. Here's the thing. I mean, I gave you a few things, but not enough probably for your liking. Here's the thing. Political communication has changed so much over the past, I've been doing this for 25, 30 years, and it's just a completely different world. And I know you probably hear that a lot, like 25, 30 years, that's a long time, but it didn't feel that long at the time. But when I look back on it, it's like, wow, things really have shifted and changed. Part of that is because of technology and how that has impacted just our standard communication practices, but also our political communication practices too. So it's changed the conversation. It's changed the public discourse that we're trying to understand. It's changing the way elections are run, the way elections are evaluated, and the way that we actually campaign. Everything has changed. As somebody said to me in 2017, crap, all the models have gone out the window. And I thought, that's really true. Like, why am I teaching a course in political communication theory if the models don't work anymore? And the answer to that question is pretty simple, which is that the models may not work, but the theories are still pretty much the same. And they're going to continue to be pretty much the same. As we debate about the politics in a democracy, that requires that we have some basic understanding of how it's supposed to operate, meaning communicatively. How is it supposed to operate? The vote is the way that people talk to the government. So we kind of need that portion of it if we're going to have a two-way process, which is required to have a communication process. So some of the basic core theories and ideas about political communication have not changed. Another thing that hasn't changed really is the way that we study political communication. That has not changed a whole heck of a lot. Now, everything else is what we call set dressing, as they say, right? Like it's changing, it's constantly moving, it's constantly different, but it's everything around political communication that changes. And very rarely do we see the communication itself change. We have yet to see political voting completely done away with, or we have yet to, well, for us at least, we have yet to see, campaigns that are run only on an interpersonal basis. None of that has come to fruition, and I doubt any of it will. But those are the things, the way that we communicate with our government and the way the government communicates with us. Those are the things that we're interested in political communication. And again, that covers every aspect of it, every part of campaigns, the overall discourse, the ethics of it, political advertising, presidential debates, political debates of any kind, issue campaigns, issues in Congress, issues in the Supreme Court, and so on. I have been absolutely baffled by the way that we have treated our federal agencies and even our international agencies, that there's a question of trust that, it used to be that the media, would sow distrust. That's been in the ether, the communication discourse forever. Since before me. That is something we can talk about, but it's something that has changed drastically in the last 5 to 7 years. So we're going to talk about that too. So today, I'm supposed to give you a history of political communication, and I'm going to do that sort of an overview, though. And in addition, I'm going to talk about the ways that we study political communication. So those two things are on our agenda for today. I looked and I searched for that one brilliant article that just sums everything up, and I thought I found them, and then it would be like, this is in China. This is in England. That's not helpful to me. Okay, this is from 2010. It's 2021. That's a little old. I'm not really sure that takes into account anything. I find stuff from 2017 that only talked about prior to 2016. That's not helpful because academics are always behind. We're about 4 years behind in political communication on a regular basis. That has to do with the fact that political communication and theory, the study of political communication, is not foresight. We cannot say what's going to happen. We can't predict. But what we can do is explain what has happened and acknowledge whether or not we want it to continue that way, whether we want to change it. If we do want to change it, how are we going to make it change? If we want to maintain it, how are we going to maintain it? Now, you might think we're in the academy, nobody's listening to us anyway, but that's actually not true. I don't know if you've ever watched a news program, but a lot of them actually have academics on there talking about what's supposed to happen. And then they bring in the lawyers and the judges who say, and here is what's happening, which those two things often actually gel. We just don't realize it in the moment. So political communication is incredibly time-tied. It is absolutely chronologically challenged in the sense that we have to be able to understand that we cannot predict anything at all, like at all. So what's the point? The point is to understand how our political communication processes work, to understand what's failing about them, and as I said before, what we want to maintain and what we need to change and how we're going to do that. So let's start way back when. Now, most people who have taken 552 from me will tell you that technology is the major change to communication processes, particularly in politics. That every time a new technology came out in the past, it has greatly changed our political discourse, right? For example, the newspapers, they were actually politically aligned way back when. It's this stuff called yellow journalism. I'm not sure if you all have studied the history of journalism, but yellow journalism was incredibly, witty, dry, sarcastic, biting, and each newspaper had its own political affiliation in some way. Like, there might be one that's more conservative, one that's more liberal, one that's communist or way off into left field, one that's way off into right field, take your pick. And there could be several newspapers that ascribe to one political philosophy or another, but the idea is that they were party identified. So this idea of the completely unbiased political information machine, it doesn't live. It never did. So let's just stop pretending that that's a possibility. And let's talk about what happened. Well, first of all, we assumed that we knew where our information was coming from, right? If a newspaper just simply announced, okay, we're with the Democratic Party, that's who we always support, or we're with the Republican Party, that's who we always support, then we would know that. And knowing that going in meant that you had enough information to evaluate what you were learning to a great extent, actually. It wasn't until we stopped knowing where our information was coming from that things got a little bit murky. Things got questionable. And all of a sudden, we're like 5,000 books written about bias in the media. Media has always been biased. It was when we started to pretend that it wasn't that we ran into trouble. And you might ask me, well, when the heck was that? Well, let's see. The newspapers and such were in the late 17 to early 1800s. And we were talking about media bias all the way back to the 20th century. So that's the 1900s, which means that my guess is somewhere in the 1800s, late 1800s is somewhere where that happened. And I'm not exactly sure why. I think it was that people started to say that they need to be removed from the story that they were telling. They needed to be removed from the information that they were sharing. This is the same thing that we get in science. And I'm using that in quotation marks, not because I don't believe science exists, but because people use that word sort of in a derogatory way, and I certainly am not. The idea of science being explained to the general population is mind-boggling bad. Okay, so people don't receive scientific or political information very well. What information do we receive well? Probably like the police blotter and what happened today, and maybe the weather. Right? These are things that we know we can count on. Like, okay, that's what happened. That's great. But when it comes to political issues or social issues and healthcare issues of any type, we suddenly become very confused. It becomes very difficult. This study would be called the rhetoric of science. Studying the rhetoric of science is a fascinating place that I'd love to be, but right now we're not there. However, we will touch on it a little bit here today and in the coming months. You probably have figured out why. Because when you throw a political mess into a pandemic, or the other way around, however it happens, when you do that, when those two things collide, it becomes incredibly difficult to communicate with your polity, to communicate with your citizenry. It's almost impossible because people don't want to listen, or they think they know better, or they listen and they evaluate it differently, or they don't have a knowledge base that's similar to a lot of others. And we get these clashes of local social policy, like mandates for masks, for example, right? Now, why we didn't see this coming, we did. Everybody did. People who study political communication particularly saw the problem that was coming with this pandemic. It wasn't going to be just about the number of deaths and the way that the disease worked. It was going to be about how we as a citizenship, how we actually were going to deal with it. And that became a political issue very, very quickly. And we predicted that it would. This is not a big surprise. There are people going around, why is this a political issue? I agree. I don't know why it's a political issue. All I know is that it was going to be no matter what we did. So there was a time, and I'll tell you this, I do like to do a lot of personal stories because in politics, you don't want to call people out, have them be compromised by what you're saying. And I don't want to mislead anybody. And the only person I can really speak for is me and the people in my immediate area, family, friends, etc. So those are the only people I can speak about, which means that you're going to get a lot of stories about me. There was a time not too long ago, it was this year, where I walked into a store with a mask on and somebody said sheep. And I was just like, okay, well, I'd rather be a sheep than be dead. Thank you. Have a good day. Right? Like, I mean, what are you supposed to say to that? Or the person who came up to me and said, why are you living in fear? And I said, I'm not sure. I don't think I am. And they were like, well, you're wearing a mask. And I'm like, that's not about living in fear. That's about me making a logical decision based on the evidence that I've been shown. And they left. They were gone. There was no conversation happening there. I'm not sure why. I mean, why not engage me, right? If you have a really good argument for why this is a political debate, I'm more than willing to listen to it. Right now, I don't believe that it should be, but it is. And that's sort of what we have to accept, right? And you might be thinking, well, of course you did, because that's pretty much the sentiment around here. I mean, in this area, maybe even some of you ascribe to that. Well, here's the thing for me. I was wearing personal protection equipment long before it was cool. I have pictures that come up on Facebook once a year, when they give you your memories from, this is from 8 years ago. And I believe it was actually like 2016 when this happened. So I had the 5-year anniversary memory of this pop up last year or this year. And basically what it was me modeling the purple gloves and the purple mask and the glasses and a hat and long sleeves, because at the time I had started a new medication that made me incredibly immune compromised, and I still am. But at that time, there was no pandemic. There was no real reason that would motivate somebody except that they were that susceptible to illness. And so I ended up having to wear the gloves and the mask for a couple months, if I recall correctly. And nobody stopped me and said, "Why are you wearing that?" Nobody called me a sheep. Nobody said anything to me because at the time it was just, she's obviously wearing it for a reason. But now it's become a political issue. Now it's, oh, well, if you're wearing a mask, it's because you live in fear and you hate Republicans or whatever. Take your pick. When for someone like myself, and I'm sure millions of other people in the world, wearing a mask was normal prior to the pandemic. So that's why I'm wearing a mask, right? There are places where I don't wear a mask. That would be outside. I take my daughter to places that she's allowed to go because she's vaccinated, she's 12, she's healthy, and she can do it. Great. Go off, have a good time. I'll pick you up later. Right? Because the fact of the matter, it's not that casual, by the way. She's usually with people that I trust. Always with people that I trust. But she can go places that I can't go. I'm comfortable with her being out in public when I'm not. But that's been the case since at a minimum 2012, when I started dealing with my compromised immune system. So everybody who's out there wearing masks and everything, they may have worn them before, you just didn't notice it. Now all of a sudden we notice it. It becomes a thing that we use to communicate with people. It becomes a way of identifying people. And that's the key word for right now, identification. In political communication, we have studied it in terms of who identifies as what. Pick a category. You must be in a box, right? And it's always been that way. Gender has always been that way. But as you've seen, we can change that conversation. And we are on both fronts, actually. A lot of people who are saying, well, I'm middle of the road. No, you're not. What you are is a mix of conservative and liberal ideas. So what's that make you? Are you more Democrat, more Republican? What are you? Are you just middle of the road? You can't be middle of the road because you have strong opinions. That's the way I am. I always scored right in the middle of the political spectrum. I was like, that's not true. I have an opinion. I know how I feel. I'm not just, I am party affiliated. I was at the time. And I didn't like that I had to identify just that one way, that was my only way. Why couldn't we talk about issues instead? And that debate is still going on, by the way, because as you can tell, we still have two parties and pretty much that's it. The other parties have not grown big enough just yet. Instead, we keep throwing people into the Republican and the Democrat parties and running from there, which is kind of bizarre. I thought a long time ago when the Tea Party came out that the parties would split apart. That the Republican Party specifically would split apart and that there would be a new party. And now we'd have three parties at a minimum, plus the Independent Party would be able to come up, or the Green Party, or the Communist Party, or I'm missing a bunch of really other good ones. The one that Ross Perot belonged to, I don't remember the name of that. And so there's a lot of parties that have the potential to become a part of our system if people can identify that way and still make a difference in the vote. Right this second, that's not the case. Right this second, if you're not Democrat or Republican, I'm sorry. And if nothing proved that that's the current state of thing, I'm not saying that's how it should be. I'm not saying that's how it will continue to be. I'm just saying that's how it is right now. Then Bernie Sanders would have been able to run on an independent ticket against Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump in 2016, but he wasn't, right? And he joined the Republican Party, which was just bizarre for a number of reasons, mainly his history, but for a number of reasons, we couldn't understand why these career politicians would let that happen, like Jeb Bush and I forget who else, Fiorina was on there, and Cruz and Rubio. I'm thinking of, and was McCain up there? No, he wasn't up there for that. So what we get is a mishmash of ideas and people all identifying the same way. And what that creates is division. And you've heard a lot about division. And I'm not talking about Democrat versus Republican, although that is definitely a division. Black versus white, big division. Men versus women, division. Okay, I'm not talking about those divisions. I'm talking about divisions within the party. The Republican Party is struggling greatly right now. They're sort of getting to the point where they might implode which was what I thought was going to happen with the Tea Party, right? I thought there would be like this splitting off, this branching off. People are now calling it the party of Trump versus Republicans. There's just not a lot, and there's people who are calling it the far left or Bernieites versus the Democrats, and so we're seeing that the push towards more parties for the purpose of identification is in fact occurring. Okay, so that's a major change in political action and political behavior. Therefore, political identification, which is generally expressed through communication, is actually one of the biggest problems that we're struggling with right now. People don't want to be put into only one particular, myopic sort of viewpoint. The best example right now, and I hesitate to bring it up, but I'm going to, the best example of this right now is Joe Biden and the abortion debate. Now, you won't remember this because it was before I was born, so I obviously don't remember it firsthand, but you may have heard that John F. Kennedy was a Catholic, and they gave him hell for that. I mean, are you only going to do what the Pope tells you to do? What do you say about the fact that you worship multiple gods? I mean, take your pick as to what they would say, but they thought it was bad policy to have a Catholic in the White House because he would only do what the Pope told him to. He wouldn't do what was best for the country. Joe Biden didn't really see that come at him at all because it was resolved. Okay, yeah, you have some complaints, you have some worries, but that's not what's of concern right this second. What's of concern right this second is that, he is on the Democratic ticket. And we have already had a Catholic president, and he did not trade us off to, some medieval era Pope loving, worshiping people who are stuck with only one view. That did not happen. John Kennedy did not do that. So Joe Biden gets his chance. But then the abortion question comes up, and it is true that the Catholic Church has come out against pro-choice views. That is 100% true. And so the question has now come in, how could you possibly identify as a Democrat and a Catholic? See, there's not even a political question in there. It's how are you identifying as a Catholic and a Democrat? How could you possibly do that? Well, my father, God rest his soul, he's been dead since 2005, but he would tell you that being a Democrat is part of being Catholic. And I would ask him to explain that to you, but he can't. And I was too young to ask him why or what he meant by that. But I think I'm starting to figure out what he meant was that his values, his personal values were jiving with, or not jiving. They were, what am I trying to say here? They were similar in his religion as well as his politics. Now, the question is, how is that possible when the Catholic Church flat out says that it is against any pro-choice action at all? Well, the easy answer is that because I'm a Catholic and a Democrat does not mean that I agree with everything that Catholics and Democrats do. That is what it comes down to. Now, you're probably looking at me thinking, okay, so who are you to speak about this? Because you're not Joe Biden. No, I am not. But I am a Catholic who was raised as a Democrat. Okay. So I've experienced this it's a weird thing. People have asked me how I could possibly be a professor and also be a Catholic. Apparently there's some problem with science and religion. Okay. That's fine. I don't happen to mix the two. They're really separate to me, like very different, right? So Joe Biden tries to straddle that line as well. Like, well, I am Catholic and I believe in the Catholic values for myself, but I am not going to tell somebody else how to believe or what to believe because the Constitution tells me I can't do that. Constitution is an agreement. It's a social contract between us and our government that dictates how that relationship is supposed to work. Now, what is a social contract? A social contract is an unspoken, unwritten, agreed upon set of rules and regulations that we sort of have, like things that we've done not just for the purpose of tradition, but because that's the way it works. The Constitution of the United States of America is based on the idea of a social contract of, you'll note that we don't put in there, you shall not kill anybody, because that is just a generally accepted thing. Although I said it like a 10 commandment, I didn't mean it quite like that. Murder is wrong. That's a generally agreed upon principle. We don't think you should kill other people. That's how we roll. Okay. The idea that animals are less important than humans, which I'm not saying I agree with that, by the way. I'm just saying that's the way it is, right? Like if you run over a dog, you don't have to stop. But if you hit a person, you're in trouble, right? So if you don't stop, especially, but there are generally socially accepted things that we do. This comes from John Locke. It comes from the Magna Carta. This has been handed down in our history, in the history of Western democracies. This has been handed down. So we're based on a social contract, and then we try to tie people to their identity the way that we want to tie them to their identity. Okay. There's no doubt that there are differences between conservative and liberal values and Democrats and Republicans and how they what they argue for and what values they use. But if you look at the way the parties have been working lately, there's a lot more there's a lot more disagreement going on within the parties than there is agreement. And that's why we have such a chaotic, weird way of doing things right this second. It's not a failure at the moment. Let's hope that it never comes to that. But as long as we keep politicizing our social contract, it's going to get really nasty really soon, in case it hasn't already. I am fearful of what's going to happen in Texas. I am fearful of the fact that the Supreme Court just overnighted this thing, like it's freaking FedEx, and said, there it is. It's totally legal. Like, when did you have time to read the briefs? When did the lawyers have time to write the briefs? See, I don't think there was any actual debate there. It was just how people felt. Well, I feel this way, so I really don't care how anybody else feels. And it's a weird irony that that's how we live in our country, because we're supposed to have the freedom to practice whatever values and ideals we have and that we hold dear. But at the same time, we're only allowed to hold them if they're in agreement with everybody else. That's not the way we've been. So if you take the abortion debate, for example, if you don't think that anybody should have an abortion, then don't have one, and encourage the people around you not to. But if you're going to tell people you can or cannot do something, you have to be incredibly careful with that. Now, do I wish that this never became an issue for Congress or for the Supreme Court? Yeah, I do. I really, really do. But it did. So we're stuck with it. And it did before I was born. So I'm really stuck with it. In fact, if you go back and look, I was born in 1974. Roe v. Wade was 1973. If you look at the trends of 1974, the class of 1974 in any yearbook in the United States of America, it is the smallest class all the way up. Doesn't gain any more people. More people weren't born in 1974. And if you're wondering why is that, I imagine that legalizing abortion had something to do with that. Is that a bad thing? Is that a good thing? I have no idea. All I'm saying is that there are certain policies that we put into place that have great impact. Great, not grave. I'm not evaluating this one way or another, good or bad, but great impact on our behavior. And that means a great impact on who we vote for. And that also means that all of our political ideas and philosophies get tied up into one identifying marker, and that's the party. So, yellow journalism, newspapers, then we start to realize, hey, maybe it would be better if we had a third person point of view to just report the news. Okay, that didn't work out so well either, because there's no such thing as a third person view. Yes, we can try to remove ourselves from any situation. We can evaluate the impacts of something. We can look at a story that's developing and tell it a certain way, and identify that way. And that helps decrease the amount of bias that we're not showing, but everything is biased in one way or another. So we need to just stop saying that. That'd be super helpful. So if you say to me, well, what about MSNBC? What about Fox News? What about these truly politically oriented and incredibly individualistically the values of the individual being displayed and argued as if it's fact? And here's my point. Fox News is no longer a news station. It is now considered an entertainment station. So Roger Ailes, in his brilliance, did in fact have Fox, it was a news station. It was for years, decades. I watched it. I loved watching Bill O'Reilly until 2003. He said on the air something about, don't send your kids to college because they won't learn anything. They'll just be told what to think. And I was just like, dude, I'm done with you. I can't do that, right? But I listened to him. I listened to Sean Hannity for a while because he was entertaining. But then 2007, 2008, I was just like, dude, I'm done with you. I can't even handle it. Now, that's my own personal bias coming out, probably. But there's probably something else you're probably thinking I don't do. I don't watch Rachel Maddow either. I barely watch YouTube clips of CNN and MSNBC. CNN, I'm still good with them. I still feel pretty confident about knowing where my news is coming from with them. And Ari Melber is incredibly entertaining. And so is Cuomo. They're entertaining, but they're not where I make my political decisions. And this goes back to something that started to happen in the mid-'80s. That's the 1980s, for those of you who are questioning that. In the mid-1980s to early 1990s really was when we saw how entertainment television was making political commentary and that people were learning about politics from Jay Leno, Johnny Carson, SNL. And it wasn't until the 2000s, I think it was the 2000s, that Jon Stewart came along and Comedy Central put on The Daily Show. Comedy freaking Central, everybody. Keep that in mind. And I remember Jon Stewart just losing his mind one day because he's like, for the love of God, we've got misinformation all over the place on news stations, and on Comedy Central, people expect me to give them the real information, the real news. I'm not a newscaster. I'm an entertainer. It's my job. But people were learning about politics from late night talk shows. And that was a very scary thing that we learned in the early 2000s. We started to go, edutainment, okay? It's educating and it's also entertaining, but political commentary, that might be a little problematic. But we let it sort of, I hate to use it, but snowball out of control. We let it go down the slippery slope. And there was no longer any regulation on who could cover what topics on what. It used to be that comedians would make commentary about past historical events, but they wouldn't necessarily, and they might make fun of a president, but it was obvious what they were doing. And they weren't trying to teach you something about the political system or sway you one way or another. They were just making fun of it. And I watched a comedian the other day. I flip through YouTube sometimes and, mostly, I go and I try to catch news. But sometimes I'm watching Guardians of the Galaxy clips or anything involving Marvel, or watching Tom Holland lip sync in full dress to Rihanna's Umbrella, because that's hilarious. Sometimes I have to go a different route, is what I'm trying to say. And I'll find comedians and I'll be like, oh, that looks interesting. And I'll press play and I'm like, oh my God, what was I thinking listening to this? This person was on a rant about gay men, but it was almost like they weren't picking on them to be derogatory. They were picking on people identified as gay because they think they're special and there's no reason for them to feel this way. And I think what was happening was that the comedian was himself a gay man. And that's that sort of gave him permission somehow to talk about people in a very derogatory way. But comedy was never supposed to be politically correct. Never, never politically correct. And it was when people like Bill Maher came up with politically incorrect, which of course was a direct play on we're going to be funny and we're going to be irreverent and it's going to be about politics. And he makes no apologies about where he comes from. So if you're going to tell me that you're citing information from Bill Maher, I know automatically that I need to take that with an understanding that this is coming from a really, truly very liberal, far left person. And that's okay. But I know that. It's when we don't know where something is coming from and we speculate and we operate from that we really get into trouble. So you may understand what I'm talking about here. And this is definitely a 20th to 21st century problem. This is really no longer about distrusting your government, which of course really became the big deal in the 1960s, right? In 1970s. It's no longer about that. It's now about not trusting any evidence that we may even see in front of us. We flat out deny things that we see. I have never experienced this in my life. And this is one of the reasons why we're having so much trouble. If we're going to study political communication, how do we understand what the good evidence is and what the bad evidence is? Why can't people tell the difference between those things? And the answer is because we think we already know the answers. We know how we feel. I feel like masks are a bad thing, therefore they are. Can we discuss it? Nope, that's how it is. You're a sheep. Move on. But I don't care. And there's where things get messy, is at the moment where we can't decide what our politics are supposed to be. Are politics for us as individuals? Are they for the individual? Or is politics about the whole polity, the community, the people around you? So in the Supreme Court, there's two different ideas you can ascribe to. One is a more communitarian approach. No, I did not say communist. No, I'm not talking about Russia. No, I'm not talking about the Red Scare. I said communitarian versus the individualistic, okay, or the libertarian. Not in a derogatory political way at all. That's the word, libertarian. The libertarian viewpoint is that the individual rights always come above the rights of the community. These would be the people who say you shouldn't wear a mask. If you're vaccinated, you're fine. Don't worry about it. The communitarian approach is more that you should put the community needs above the individual needs. These would be the mask wearers who say, I'm not wearing this mask for me. I'm vaccinated. I'm wearing it so I don't give this disease to someone else. And yes, it's only potential. We don't know 100% that that's going to happen or that it could happen, but we're pretty damn sure that this can spread beyond beyond the mask, certain types of masks even. But the community is more important than my freedom to not wear a mask, so I'm going to wear a mask. And that's the more communitarian viewpoint. Now, I'll be honest with you. If I wasn't compromised, if I wasn't immune compromised and I wasn't on chemotherapy and I didn't leave my house because that's how frightening it can be sometimes for people who are extremely immune compromised. I do leave my house, by the way. I go outside and I do pick up at Walmart for groceries. Which means that I communicate with one person when I go to Walmart. And my gosh, that is nice. Not that I want to go to Walmart, but you know, they're easy. They're big. They're everywhere. And they have what I know that they have is what I want. So why would I walk into a Hy-Vee or a Price Cutter or somewhere else if I don't have to? Now, my husband, when he goes shopping, he goes locally to more local stores and things like that for the purpose of supporting local businesses. But for me, mask on, gloves on. I would have to dress in like a hazmat suit because I don't want to be around people that much, that close. Now, Hy-Vee and Price Cutter are probably better about it, but Walmart, if I remember correctly, you're like there's no 6 foot space anywhere. In fact, I'm not sure 6 feet is enough for me. I need more. That's for my own personal feeling about it. I don't know how I would feel if I didn't have to protect myself that way. But I'd like to think that as a Catholic and as, well, I don't know. I just like to think that I would probably consider the community before myself, but it's because it's easy for me to wear a mask. It's not hard. It's not a difficulty for me, even though I have a lung disease. It's not difficult for me to wear a mask to make sure that I stay alive, right? Which means I'm protecting other people too. I'd like to think that there's some altruism in me wearing the mask, but the truth of the matter is that I wear it for myself. Now, that being said, individualism or libertarianism versus communitarianism, neither one of those is good or bad. Okay. It's just the way we go about evaluating. For example, when the Supreme Court evaluated a pornography case, oh God, I used to know the name of it, but I can't remember the name of it. It was a long time ago. When they were evaluating that, they all took the belief that you have a right to watch pornography, but the communitarian approach is they can determine what is and is not legal to have. So if you have pornography in your trunk, this was back in the 90s and early 2000s. I don't know what the case is now, to be honest with you. But if you had pornography in your trunk of any kind, and you drove from Texas to Missouri, you'd have a real problem getting through Oklahoma. Now, you wouldn't actually get pulled over for that. I don't think they would look at you and go, oh, you look like someone who has pornography in their trunk. That's not what I'm saying here. But if you got pulled over and they did a search of your car and there was pornography in there, that's another law violation in Oklahoma, or it was back then. I'm not sure now. Do not quote me on that now. Quote me on that back 30 years ago. Okay? 30 years. Oh my God, I'm old. Okay. So you really start to learn your age when you guys all stay the same age and I get older every year. So the idea of the community, in this case, the state of Oklahoma, the city of Norman had its own rules. Oklahoma City had its own rules, but the state had banned pornography. So they believed that for their state, for their community, there should not be pornography in their state. Other places, you take like Pennsylvania, for example, and again, I'm going back like 30 years because it's changed, but in Pennsylvania, there is a county in Pennsylvania that houses Slippery Rock University, and for the love of me, I cannot think of what the name of that county is, but at the time my brother was going to college at Slippery Rock, yeah, it's called Slippery Rock. At the time that he was going to Slippery Rock University, he actually was in a dry county. That county was dry, no alcohol. I'm not talking about on campus. I'm talking about the whole county, okay? They have since changed that. They are no longer a dry county. The town that I grew up in, or the town I worked in when I was younger, Beaver, Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania has weird names. Did you ever notice that? It has like weird names in there. In Beaver, the city of Beaver, you weren't allowed to drink alcohol there. So if we wanted to go for like a drink after work, for example, obviously I was old enough. If I wanted to go for a drink after work, I worked at the courthouse, then we would have to go out of the city of Beaver, which it wasn't that hard because there was another city to every north, south, east, west, southeast, everywhere around that would allow you to have a drink, but you had to actually get out of the city. All those things have now changed. I would imagine Oklahoma has also changed its laws, but the reason for those laws at that time was to protect what people felt they were doing was protecting their community. They were thinking about it from a communitarian perspective rather than from a libertarian perspective of the individual over the community. So in the history of political policy, public policy making, these trends of the individual versus the community, your identity, and the way that we think about media news and information that we receive. Those three things have greatly impacted our public policy and therefore our public conversation. So what happened? Because I keep mentioning 2017 as the key to what broke a lot of our models. And that answer is very, very clean and easy. In 2016, we had such a divisive presidential primary and general season. I mean, just on all sides. I'm not picking a side here, but we had, I mean, such vitriol for Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, such vitriol. And yet they were the ones that we decided to put into the general election. How does it make sense that you get the most controversial people into the general election? Why didn't we decide to go a little softer than the crazies on each side? I'm not crazy. Then what's the word I want to use? I don't think extremist is the right word either. What is the right word? How about divisive? Divisive personalities. I mean, people felt very strongly about Hillary, very strongly about Trump, one way or another. These other people just like fell by the wayside. We didn't even have the conversation. I mean, let's be honest, Bernie never had a shot. Why? Because he wasn't affiliated with the Democratic Party. That's just a thing. People are very, very touchy about their parties. But then again, Donald Trump wasn't a member of the Republican Party until semi-recently. He was a hardcore Democrat for many years early on. The man is, 72? He's my mother's age, I believe. They have a lot of history. Donald Trump has a lot of history in this country, and not a lot of it is political. But he always did share his political opinion because as one of the richest people in America, I don't know if he really was or not, so I'm putting that in air quotes, but as one of the richest people in America, certainly one of the biggest celebrities, people asked his opinion a lot. And so when he says, I was involved in politics for the past 40 years, well, maybe, kind of, sort of, I guess. We could say you had an opinion. Does that mean he was involved in politics? I'm not really sure. The idea of the first female president potentially being elected, that was scary for a lot of people, because it's such a change and such a difference. So now we did end up electing Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. And that, therefore, we have our first female vice president. Okay. Now, the way that election played out is messed up. Okay. In the 1800s, in 2000, and then in 2016, we had the unique experience of the Electoral College voting for the president that the polity, the public, the citizenship did not vote for. Okay. That's just the way it was. Everybody agreed. There was the count of the ballots, and there was the count of the Electoral College votes, and it didn't match. And so it's happened before. 1800s, 2000, and 2016. Now, why did it happen so closely together, 2000 and 2016? Why didn't it take another 200 years or 150 years, whatever it was? I mean, we went through all the 1900s with that never happening. Why? And the answer has to do with not the way we count ballots, not the machines, not policy changes. It has to do with how many people are now voting and how many people make their voting decisions based on information that they receive and their ability to critically analyze that information. That has changed. And so some people, when the Electoral College came back and said that Donald Trump won in 2016 and came back and said that, that they agreed with the polity in the popular vote for Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, that caused people to say, why? How does that happen? How can that be? Last time I lost a popular vote, but I got the electoral college vote. Why am I not doing that now? Well, because it's different now. Different people voted. There were people who turned 18 between 2016 and 2020. They were able to vote now. That changes. People die off. It's a process called generational replacement. Like when your great grandparents died off, then your grandparents sort of ruled the roost. That's the way it was in my house. And then my grandparents died off. Now my mom rules the roost. Actually, my brother does because he just takes over, because I come from an incredibly Irish, Italian, Slovak, Catholic family where the men take over. This explains why I moved to Missouri, doesn't it? So I'm just kidding. I love my family to death, but there is a hierarchy. And as the generations die off, other generations replace them. And therefore, the values of my mother's generation die off, and the values of me and my siblings become our standard. Here's another problem, though. Generation X, which I am a proud member of, by the way. Generation X, which is people who were born between, 64 and 81, I believe. Or 69 and 81, somewhere in there. I don't remember. But it's that sort of block there. And I say 81 because my youngest brother was born in 80, and he does not like to be called, and he was born in 81, excuse me, and he does not like to be called a Gen Y. That really kind of bothers him. So I just put it up to 81. I think that's correct, though. I think that's the actual spread there. We're also the smallest generation, which means that we've been ruled by the baby boomers this whole entire time. And then when they all die off, which is happening quicker than we'd like to think about it, then the next generation is going to really take over. So Gen X, we didn't have a voice when we were younger because we didn't take it. And we're certainly not going to get one handed to us now. So we're going to take our Cure tapes. That's a band, by the way, The Cure, and curl up in our black clothes and cry for our moms while the rest of the world does its thing, because that's exactly what we did when we were being raised. In other words, we were raised to believe that everything would be taken care of. We didn't have to do anything. Other people would do the work, and they did. What we weren't taught was that if we didn't learn how to do the work, then when we got older and it was our turn, we wouldn't know what to do. And I think that's exactly sort of what's happening, is that those of us in this generation between the ages of 30 and 45 are just, well, I say 30 and 45. I'm not there. I'm older than that. So I guess it would be like 35 to 50, somewhere in there. Those of us in that generation are sort of, we've been digging and kicking and trying to find our way through the morass that is our political system. And my father, I was lucky. My father forced me to learn. He forced me to vote the first time. I remember that day. I was not a happy camper. He forced me to vote. He forced me to become involved. He made me go to town halls with him. When I was 6 years old, my uncle ran for state representative in our district, and I was out in the freezing cold in November in Pennsylvania, back when we had snow. It was so cold, and I was 6, my sister was 7, my brother John was 4. We were out there with my dad, and we were handing out these little cards that had like a mimeographed picture of my uncle saying, "Please vote for my uncle." We were adorable. Electioneering was allowed, and he came within 157 votes of winning, which, if I had been running that campaign, I'm just kidding. So I was involved from a very early age, and politics is just something that I did. I was good at. Nowadays, it's like, do I really want to be involved in this? This is a mess. Well, yeah, of course I do. I want to understand, as a member of the American citizenry, I want to understand how we make change and how we can make change for the better. Now, it's unfortunate that a lot of times I get frustrated. For those of you who've known me for a while, I used to curate the Be Civil, Be Heard nonprofit, which was advocating for civility in our city and in our communities. And I gave that up in 2020, I think. maybe it was 2019. It's been a little while. I gave it up because for the love of everything I had in me, I couldn't do it anymore. I was so frustrated and angry with the way that people were not communicating civilly. And a civil civic discourse just seems impossible sometimes. But, I took a little breather, spent some time with the 12-year-old, went to a couple of amusement parks, got my brain in gear. And, I'm a huge advocate for civility. I still am a huge advocate for civility. I don't want to run the nonprofit anymore. I gave that to somebody at OTC and they're doing a great job. But I don't want to be in charge of that anymore. I want to lead in a different way. So, identity, you're probably wondering, well, gee, what's your political affiliation? And I'm going to tell you, I lived in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I was raised by a steelworker. I was raised by a lawyer. I was raised by a banker, an accountant, excuse me. I was raised by a family that was, for the most part, blue collar until my father became a lawyer. And even then, he became a public defender and then a district attorney. So it's not like he ever made money. I was forced to go to Catholic school. And I was raised in, Southwest Pennsylvania, in the middle of coal country and steel country. So I moved to Missouri. And before that, Oklahoma. And before that, Ohio. Somewhere in there, I lived in Minnesota for 2 years too. The point is that good luck figuring out what my political affiliation is because it's irrelevant. It's irrelevant for most of us in the sense of what it is that we talk about when it comes to talking about political communication. It does not matter what your political party is. When it does matter is when we're evaluating other people's political discourse. So when we're talking about presidents, when we're talking about campaigns, when we're talking about Congress, and when we're talking about the Supreme Court, that's when that part of identity becomes important. So what are the ways that we study political communication then? I mean, how do we wrap our brains around all of those issues, those three main things that have changed over time? How do we get our brains around it? We can't just run out and evaluate political ads anymore. That's not going to do it. We can't just get on the Presidential Debate Commission. That's not going to do it. We have to understand a lot more than that now. And trying to get a hold of the polity, trying to get a hold of different individual citizens and come up with a number big enough to be able to represent all of us is practically impossible. Teaching people how to understand evidence is only slightly more possible. But we have to do these things in order to understand. But we can't go out and ask every single person, what is it you want from your politicians? What do you want to hear them say? We can't do that. So we just sum it all up with Democrat, Republican, other, for the most part. I always advocate having at least 7 parties on there, or 7 affiliations of some sort, maybe even at least 5, but 2 or 3 where the third is other. We're not learning a whole lot, are we? But here's how we do it. There are, generally speaking, just like all of your other classes teach you, 4 paradigms to understanding how we study something. The first is, of course, the quantitative approach. That's not the approach. The approach is actually called positivistic or post-positivistic. That approach, that paradigm suggests that there is something out there that we can learn, that one thing that we need to know, that one singular truth that will explain everything to us. And all we have to do is go out and find it. That doesn't work in political communication. The next paradigm, is the humanistic or the interpretivist. And this one is probably the one that's most often used. Now, the post-positivists are generally found in political science departments and in other social science areas more than they are in the humanistic or interpretive or artistic colleges like we are in. So in the qualitative arena, is where the humanists are. They are looking to ask questions and find out interactions and to speak to a few, to represent the many, that we interpret from a few for the many, so that we do focus groups, we do town hall discussions, we do smaller group research rather than massive surveys via telephone or computer or anything else. Okay, so most of the time, the interpretivist point of view is attempting to get at the story behind the citizenry. In order to do that, we sit down with them and we talk with them. So more often than not, that's where we're at. The third, of course, is the critical, where people analyze speeches, structures, bills, issues, the way we talk about things from a critical perspective to find out why or how people are using it to maintain power, or to gain power, take it away from other people. And I don't normally advocate that you use that in order to understand your audience when you're trying to run a campaign. It's not extremely helpful. But if you look at the abortion debate in Texas, I'm sorry to go back to it again, but if you look at that, that's exactly where that argument is occurring right now, is people saying, well, women need to have more power over their bodies. Men saying you don't have the right to end a life, murder is wrong. And it's actually not just men versus women, obviously. There are men saying that women have the right to control their bodies, and women saying, no, that's not okay to murder. This is a highly idealized debate. It's ideology. It's personal, and we have to make it the political. So it makes sense that a critical position, a paradigm, would make more sense there. And then finally, the sort of more postmodern paradigm, which basically says we're never going to agree on anything, in its extreme. But the idea that our circumstances actually change our experience of the world, our view of the world, and our sort of perspective, that's very real. I don't see a lot of people doing that in politics and political communication because we're trying to find something that is generalizable, something that we can say this can apply to more than just one citizen. This is something that we can use. So for the most part, we're going to be living in the realm of the qualitative, evaluating how people respond to campaigns, generalize campaign messaging, how we create our political identity, how we express that political identity, how we're required to express that political identity. In Pennsylvania, by the way, we don't have open primaries. So if I lived in Pennsylvania, I would have to declare a party in order to vote in the primary. Here, I just walk in and say, today I feel like a Republican. Today I feel like a Democrat. Today I feel like a Libertarian. Take your pick. You can just be whatever you want that day for primaries. And that really doesn't force me into any one political hole. Whereas in Pennsylvania, I'm required to identify. It says on my voter card what party I belong to. And here we don't have that. So, their entire, our voting systems are based on that party ID. And look at what they call it, party identification, because it is the key thing. And maybe that's not the right way for us to be doing this, but it's how we've been doing it. And I haven't seen an alternative yet. When I hear of one, I'll let you know. So what did we get today? I don't know. We got a lot of talk today. I feel like I just had a therapy session. I'm just kidding. We understand where political communication has come from, why it's studied. We probably already understand that it goes all the way back to Aristotle. He was our first political scientist, the first one to talk about rhetoric. He said that rhetoricians are supposed to be the people who explain the government to the general population, to the citizenship, to the citizenry. And that gets us back to that whole question of standards of evidence. Poor Dr. Fauci. I wouldn't want his job. You cannot pay me enough to every day wake up and one day you're a hero and the next day you're a villain. I mean, it's just, he never knows. And really what he is a scientist who doesn't care about heroism or villainy, just only cares about, supposedly, I would assume, cares about the science of it and what that might mean for public policy and how that's supposed to work. So God bless all of them that are dealing with that right now. There's a bunch of them out there. We're not even listening to the NIH anymore. We're barely listening. We don't listen to the UN. Didn't we pull out of the UN? I think we pulled out of the UN. Are we back in? I don't even know. See, that's the problem with a confused polity, is that you have to go look these things up. Things that have been solid for 250 years are suddenly questionable. And that's one of the reasons, that's the major reason. And it happened really, again, I say in the 1900s, early 1900s. I'm sorry, I said the late 1800s before, and that's what I meant. The late 1800s is where we see that big shift because we no longer trusted, our media suddenly decided to pull back and say, we're not going to have an affiliation, we're not going to have an identification. So you just figure this out for yourself. We're just going to give you information and hopefully you get it. And I don't know if that was good or bad or indifferent, but right now we're definitely not living in that world anymore. But that's how we got here. So questioning evidence and then somehow rolling that into our identification as political beings. How do we study all that? Those are the things that we're going to be talking about. We're going to be talking about the media separately. We're going to be talking about advertising separately. We're going to be talking about debate separately, and public policy. And of course, we're going to talk about ethics. So hopefully for next time, I have something for you to read instead of having to listen to me for an hour. Hopefully my involvement in politics since I was 6, I'm 47, so 41 years involved in politics that I can remember. My years of studying it since 1992, hopefully, and my time teaching it since 2006. Hopefully that is enough for you to believe what I say about the way that political communication has changed, particularly the field of study of political communication. All right, everybody, that is it for tonight. I am tired. It's 9:30 at night. I'm going to send this off to you, and I'll be in touch with you again before the end of the week.